Hello, I'm Julia Bowler, Help America Vote Act Training Coordinator for the state of Indiana. As many of you know, working the polls on Election Day is an exciting and rewarding way to serve your community. With the support of the federal Help America Vote Act, the Indiana Secretary of State's office has created this training video to help you make the most of that service. We'll cover all you need to know for your work on Election Day. To make viewing easier, we've divided this presentation into 12 chapters, one for each major topic. As you watch, keep in mind not all Indiana counties run elections the same way. Be sure to ask your county election board if you have any questions about procedures. From all of us at the Secretary of State's office, thank you for volunteering to support free and fair elections.
Many people work at the polls across Indiana on Election Day, and each has a specific role to play. Indiana poll workers include inspectors, judges, poll clerks, election sheriffs. Just who does what at the polls? Let's start with the inspectors.
I've been an inspector for more than 4 years now. Inspectors are chosen by the political party that won the most Secretary of State votes in the county in the last election. As the inspector, I'm the chair of the precinct election board. The board is made up of the inspector and 2 judges of opposite political parties. It acts as the governing body of the election officials at each precinct. I'm also responsible for picking up election supplies, confirming the polling location at least 2 days before the election. I administer the oath to all poll workers. I'm also responsible for announcing the opening and closing of the polling place, and accompanied by the judge of the opposite political party, returning all election supplies to the county election board. Something new this year is the photo ID requirement. A member of the election board, either myself or one of the judges, must ask voters to provide photo ID. Poll clerks are not authorized to request ID. We'll talk more about photo ID in a later chapter. Inspectors may also challenge voters or receive voter challenges from other voters when one voter believes that another does not meet the legal requirements to vote in that precinct. Voter challenges will also be covered in more detail later in the video.
Next, we have judges. Judges represent both major political parties and act as the check and balance within each precinct.
As a judge, I assist the inspector in making decisions. I'm also responsible for asking voters for photo ID, assisting voters with disabilities. And as a judge of the other party, I accompany the inspector when returning election supplies to the county election board. Like inspectors, judges may also challenge a voter if there are any questions about whether they meet the requirements to vote in that precinct.
Next up on our list of poll workers are the poll clerks and assistant poll clerks. The primary job of the poll clerks is record keeping and ballot control. The clerks ask voters to provide their voter identification numbers. In optical scan counties, poll clerks will initial each ballot. Poll clerks also confirm each voter signs the poll book before casting their ballot. Finally, during primary elections, poll clerks ensure that voters who want to vote in a political primary get the correct ballot for their party's candidates. Last but not least are election sheriffs. As their name implies, election sheriffs are responsible for keeping order at the polling place. In some precincts, the duties of this job have been divided between numerous poll workers. But whoever is designated to do these duties is responsible for contacting authorities if someone violates the law at the polls. To do this, the sheriff may leave the polling place to seek help when needed. There are more than 5,000 precincts in Indiana. That translates into tens of thousands of poll workers helping Hoosier voters cast their ballots. Though poll workers typically represent a political party, their job on Election Day is to serve all voters equally, regardless of a voter's political affiliation. The first thing poll workers do on Election Day is set up the polls. Polls in Indiana are open from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. local time. Poll workers should meet at the polling place sometime before Election Day and again at 5 a.m. on Election Day. First, arrange the polling place so it's easy for people to move around. Keep in mind the needs of voters with disabilities and those needing assistance. Voting booths and ballot boxes must be in the same room with poll workers. When setting up your precinct's voting machines, please follow the instructions found in the Poll Worker Training Manual or supplied by your county election board. Outside the polls, set up the chute. The chute extends 50 feet out from the entrance to the room where voting takes place. When a 50-foot chute isn't possible, ask the election board how to proceed. It can be shorter if necessary. Make sure you know where the chute ends, so you know where campaign workers and other persons are allowed to stand. Always make sure you have enough ballots, forms, and other election materials. The inspector and judges should check the official ballots and any sample ballots to make sure they're correct, and then sign the ballot agreement. Sample ballots and voting instructions should be posted at the entrance to the polling place and by each voting booth. For a detailed checklist of opening duties, please see your poll worker training manual. It's 6 a.m. and you're now ready to officially open your polling place.
The polls for this precinct are now open.
Once open, no precinct official may leave the polling place until after the votes have been counted, or in central count counties until the ballots and election supplies are returned. From start to finish on Election Day, poll workers must always respect the rights of voters and be sensitive to their needs. The Indiana Voters' Bill of Rights lists the rights of every voter and is a useful resource when voters have questions. It describes who can vote, how to vote, and the many protections we have to make sure all eligible voters can cast their vote in their precinct. By law, the Voters' Bill of Rights must be displayed in every precinct's polling place. On Election Day, you'll also see some individuals who are not precinct election officials or voters at the polling place. These people have special privileges to observe the election: watchers, challengers, and poll book holders. All of them must present proper credentials showing their name, position, the name and title of the appointing authority, and their party affiliation. First, let's look at watchers. Watchers may be appointed by political parties or by independent candidates to observe the election. Or they may be members of the media, television, newspaper, or radio reporters. Other things to keep in mind about watchers. They can enter the polls starting at 5:30 a.m. and remain until vote counting is done. They must be allowed to see and hear what happens at the polling place. They can leave and re-enter at any time. But they may not interfere with voters or election officials, handle any official election materials, or observe how a particular voter votes. Next up are challengers and poll book holders. Challengers and poll book holders are appointed by political parties or independent candidates. Like inspectors and judges, challengers may question whether a voter meets the requirements to vote in that precinct. Poll book holders may simply observe the polls to see who has voted. Some things to remember about challengers and poll book holders. Each party or candidate may have only one of each at the polls at any one time on Election Day. Both are allowed inside the polling place. Challengers may ask for a voter's name. When asked, a voter must provide his or her name to the challenger before voting. Watchers, challengers, and poll book holders have special access to the polls and the chute, but they're not the only people you'll see on Election Day.
There are many people around the polls on Election Day, not just voters and those of us working there, so it's important to know just who is and who is not allowed inside the polling place.
Who can be inside the polling place? Voters casting ballots. Children under 18 accompanying a voter. Precinct election officials, inspectors, judges, poll clerks, and sheriffs. Deputy election commissioners. Challengers, watchers, and poll book holders with credentials. An individual authorized to assist a voter. A county election board member acting on behalf of the board. A voting system mechanic with credentials to repair a voting system. The county chairman or county vice chairman of a political party with credentials from the county election board. The Secretary of State of Indiana, unless that person is a candidate on the ballot. Now, let's look at who and what should not be in the polling place. Candidates, political party precinct committee persons, and other political party volunteers are not allowed inside the polling place except at their own precinct when they are voting. They cannot post or leave campaign materials inside the polling place, but they are allowed to be outside of the polls as long as they're outside the chute. All individuals involved in Election Day activities at the polls must adhere to a legal standard. State law defines electioneering as expressing support or opposition to any candidate, political party, or public question. A person who commits electioneering within the polls or the chute commits a Class A misdemeanor. As of July 1, 2005, each voter must show a government-issued photo ID before signing the poll list. The Precinct Election Board, the inspector, and the judges are responsible for ensuring this takes place. To be accepted, the photo ID must meet certain standards. It should display the voter's photo. The name must conform to the name on the voter registration record, but this doesn't mean it must match identically. The ID must also contain an expiration date. It should still be current or have expired sometime after the date of the most recent general election, November 2, 2004. The ID must be issued by the state of Indiana or the U.S. government. And finally, remember that the address on the ID does not need to match the address on the voter registration record. The only exceptions to this are first-time voters. We'll cover more about this in the next chapter. In most cases, an Indiana driver's license, Indiana photo ID card, military ID, or U.S. passport will be acceptable to meet the voter ID requirement. Keep in mind, though, that no voter should be turned away from the polls for failing to show a photo ID. If the voter is unable or unwilling to present an ID, the voter may cast a provisional ballot. We'll talk more about provisional ballots later in this video. There are also exemptions to the ID requirement. If the voter is unable to obtain an ID because the voter is indigent or has a religious objection to being photographed, the voter may cast a provisional ballot and then claim this exemption from the ID requirement by appearing in person before the county election board, before the deadline, affirming under penalties of perjury that they qualify for the exemption. If the voter is registered to vote and resides in the state licensed facility, such as a nursing home, where the precinct's polling place is located, the voter is also exempt from this ID requirement. For those voters who don't have a valid photo ID and would like to obtain one, the Indiana Bureau of Motor Vehicles will provide a photo ID card free of charge. BMV branches will also be open extended hours on Election Day. For more information, contact the BMV at 317-233-6000 or visit www.in.gov/BMV. In addition to the photo ID requirement, some voters must present additional documentation that confirms their address. These voters are notified of this requirement when the county receives the voter's registration application. These voters are also marked in your poll book. There are some voters who are exempt from the additional documentation requirement: military and overseas voters, and voters who present the documentation to the county voter registration office. For those who do need to present additional documentation, several kinds of documents are acceptable. An Indiana driver's license or Indiana state identification card with the voter's current name and address. Remember, these IDs can meet the photo ID requirement even if the address on the ID does not match the poll list address. But for the additional documentation requirement, the address on the ID must be current and match the poll list. A current utility bill, bank statements, government check, a paycheck, or other government documents with current name and address. All of these documents must include the voter's current name and address. The name and address on the document must also match the name and residence address on the voter's registration application. Check the poll list to confirm the match. Each type of document has its own category and code. If the document and poll list match, write the code for the document on the poll list next to the voter's name and return the document to the voter. If the voter doesn't have documents with them that meet the requirements, it's okay for them to leave the polls to retrieve the documents from their car or residence before signing the poll list. If the voter has already signed the poll list by mistake, he or she can still cast a provisional ballot at the polls and then get a copy of the document to the county voter registration office before the polls close at 6 p.m. Issuing ballots is the most important part of your work on Election Day. By making sure this is done correctly, you're protecting the fairness and integrity of the election. Upon arriving, each voter must present a photo ID to the inspector or one of the judges. The inspector or one of the judges review the ID to determine if it meets requirements. If it doesn't meet the requirements, then the voter will be challenged. If a voter signs the poll list first but does not have a photo ID that meets the requirements, the voter is not allowed to leave and go get it. They must cast a provisional ballot. If the voter's photo ID document meets the requirements, the poll clerks locate the voter's name on the poll book and proceed under the regular process. The voter signs and verifies their address on the poll list before voting. Remember, the address on the poll list does not have to be the same as on their photo ID. The clerk compares the voter's signature on the poll list with the voter's signature on their registration card. If a poll clerk questions the voter's identity based on the voter's signature, the poll clerk may challenge the voter. The poll clerk is also required to ask the voter to provide or update their voter identification number, more commonly known as the voter's Indiana driver's license number. If the voter doesn't have a license, the last 4 digits of their Social Security number serve as the voter identification number. At this time, the clerk will also verify on the poll list that the voter is not required to show additional documentation. If the voter doesn't fit into the regular voting process, there are other situations called fail-safes that protect voters' rights and help solve problems on Election Day. A voter may not need to cast a provisional ballot if one of the procedures applies to their situation. Poll workers should always check whether a fail-safe procedure can solve a problem before filling out a challenge form and issuing a provisional ballot. So, what are some of the problems that can be solved with fail-safe procedures? A voter could be left off the poll list by mistake. Records might mistakenly indicate the voter has moved out of the precinct. The voter has moved outside of the precinct, but is allowed to return to their old precinct to vote. Or the voter has proof of having applied to register to vote, but the voter's name does not appear on the poll list. You can also find detailed descriptions of when and how to use fail-safes in your poll worker training manual. In the end, if the precinct election board isn't sure whether one of the fail-safe procedures should be used, the inspector should always attempt to contact the county election board for guidance. Now, let's look at the final steps you'll take in issuing ballots. In primary elections, voters must announce the party for which they intend to vote. Be sure each voter gets the right party ballot and that their party choice is written on the poll list. In the primary election, school board offices and public questions are the only issues that can be voted on without requesting a party ballot. In optical scan counties, before handing out the ballot, both poll clerks must initial the back. Clerks should also initial the secrecy envelope when optical scan cards are used. Next, voting booths. Give each voter their ballot once a voting booth is available. Remember, clerks must also mark the poll list to show that the voter has voted in the election. How voting occurs in your precinct depends on what type of voting system is used. Different counties use different systems. Your county election board will provide you with training on your voting system. Challenging voters is an important part of protecting the integrity of an election. But challenge procedures must always be used with great caution. On one hand, it's against the law for someone who is not eligible to vote in a precinct to attempt to cast a ballot. It's also illegal for a precinct election official to fail to challenge a voter they know to be ineligible, or to challenge a voter that the official knows is eligible to vote. Always consult your county election board if you are uncertain how the challenge procedure should be used. So, who exactly may challenge a voter? A member of the precinct election board, the inspector and judges. A poll clerk, but only based on a questionable signature on the poll list. Challengers, appointed by a candidate or political party. And during primary elections, voters who belong to a political party may challenge another voter requesting that party's ballot. What are the procedures used in a challenge? Let's use the example of Vicky Voter, who arrives at the polls without her photo ID. Before she signs the poll list, the clerk lets her know she can leave to obtain her photo ID. She indicates she would rather cast a provisional ballot and bring her ID to the county election board before the deadline. What happens next? The person challenging the voter must complete the pre-4 affidavit stating the reason for the challenge. The challenged voter must then complete the bottom or the back of the pre-4, affirming that they are legally qualified to vote in the precinct. Make sure the voter provides all the information required on the pre-4 form and signs and dates it under Challenged Voter Affirmation. This form can be printed separately or on the Pro 2 envelope for the convenience of voters and poll workers. Now, let's take a closer look at provisional ballots. Provisional ballots are very similar to other ballots in appearance, but there are ways to distinguish them. The document will state that it is a provisional ballot. It will also include the circuit court clerk's seal and signature, much the same as an absentee ballot. There are also some special procedures in provisional ballot voting that are similar to casting an absentee ballot. How does one cast a provisional ballot? First, the inspector determines that the pre-4 has been properly completed by both challenger and voter. The voter then signs the poll list and confirms their address. Both poll clerks initial the back of the ballot. The poll clerks then give the voter a provisional ballot and a Pro 2 security envelope. The voter then takes the ballot to the voting booth and marks it privately. When the voter is finished marking the ballot, they enclose it in the secrecy envelope and seal it. The voter returns the sealed envelope with the ballot inside to the inspector or one of the judges. In return, the voter will receive the Pro 9 form, providing them with contact information for the county election board and follow-up information on provisional ballots. With 92 counties across the state, Hoosiers use a variety of voting machines in order to cast their ballots on Election Day. The Help America Vote Act of 2002 eliminated the use of punch card and lever machines. As a result, many counties will have new voting equipment for 2006. Some counties use traditional hand-counted ballots, particularly during smaller local elections. Most, however, use either optical scan ballots or direct record electronic machines, also called touchscreen voting machines. More information on each machine can be found in your poll worker training manual and from your county election board. The Help America Vote Act requires that each polling place be accessible to voters with disabilities. Polling place locations and voting systems are chosen specifically to meet accessibility standards for voters with disabilities. Part of your job as a poll worker is to understand the accessibility features and equipment in your polling place. All voters have the right to vote privately and independently. No voter may be denied the right to vote because of any mental, physical, or sensory limitation. Here are some guidelines for improving accessibility on Election Day. First, be considerate of the extra time it might take for a disabled voter to do things. Speak directly to the disabled voter rather than to a companion who may be accompanying them. Speak calmly, slowly, and directly to a voter with a hearing impairment. You can also write a note to the voter. ask permission before pushing someone in a wheelchair or otherwise assisting a voter in moving around the polling place. Greet a person who is visually impaired by letting the person know who and where you are. Provide a guiding device such as a ruler or a card for signing forms. When offering walking assistance, allow the person to take your arm and tell the person if you are approaching steps or an incline. Be aware that dogs assisting people with disabilities must be admitted to all buildings. Some voters may need assistance voting on Election Day. A voter may be assisted in the voting booth only if the following conditions are true. The voter has a disability, permanent or temporary, or is unable to read or write English. And the voter, before entering the voting booth, requests assistance. A voter may request assistance from a relative or friend, but may not designate their employer or a union representative to assist them. A voter may also request assistance from the poll workers. In this case, both judges must accompany the voter into the voting booth to assist. Anyone who assists a voter in casting their ballot must complete the Pre-3 affidavit of voter assistance at the polls before assisting them in the voting booth, including the judges. Some final thoughts on accessibility at the polls. Precinct officials cannot leave the polling place with election materials to help a disabled voter cast their ballot. Disabled voters must enter the polling place to vote. Make sure you review the instructions for operating the accessible voting systems in your precinct before the polls open. And finally, if you're ever in doubt about how to best assist a voter with a disability, ask your county election official. Counties can choose one of two methods for counting absentee ballots. Some counties designate one central location for counting ballots, rather than doing it at their precincts. Other counties count absentee ballots right at the polls. In your poll worker training manual, you'll find step-by-step instructions on how to count absentee ballots. During the process, absentee ballots can be rejected for a number of reasons. The voter already voted in person. There's no voter signature on the ballot envelope or on the ballot application. The absentee ballot will also be rejected if the envelope is open or resealed, or if the ballot affidavit is insufficient. Please follow the instructions in your poll workers training manual. The rejected ballots, along with the counted ballots, will be returned to the County Election Board office, along with the other election supplies. The Precinct Election Board may count absentee ballots before the polls are closed. However, providing information about absentee vote totals to anyone other than a member of the Precinct Election Board prior to the close of the polls is a Class D felony and punishable by law. For more information on absentee voting, see your poll worker training manual. The close of the polls signals the end of voting, but not the end of the day for poll workers.
The polls are now closed.
With the inspector's announcement, now only people left in the chute or already in the process of voting may still vote. Once everyone has voted, the machines are locked or voting system disassembled, and the polling place is returned to its original setup. Only authorized election officials and watchers are allowed to remain inside. Procedures for counting ballots are somewhat different in each county. Once the counting of ballots at the precinct is complete, the inspector and the judge of the opposite political party return all election materials to the County Election Board office. This should take place as soon as possible after polls have closed. Election Day is now over, and thanks to your hard work, Hoosier voters everywhere have made their choices. For a detailed checklist of how to close the polls, please see your poll worker training manual. Now, let's review some of the key points we've learned about serving as a poll worker on Election Day. First, photo ID. A valid ID must fit the following criteria. It must display the voter's photo, and the voter's name on the ID must conform to the name on the voter registration record. Remember, conform does not mean identical. The voter's ID must contain an expiration date and either still be current or have expired sometime after November 2, 2004. The voter's ID must be issued by the state of Indiana or the U.S. government. In most cases, an Indiana driver's license or Indiana photo ID card, a military ID, or U.S. passport is sufficient. Remember, the address on the ID does not need to match the poll book unless the voter is marked in the poll book. Now let's review first-time voters and additional documentation. Certain first-time voters who registered by mail will be marked on the poll list as needing additional documentation. To fill this requirement, they can use any number of approved documents that show their name and current address, including their photo ID, a paycheck, or government document. Next, challenges and provisional ballots. Challenges should be used with caution. A voter should be challenged if they cannot present photo identification that meets the requirements. This process uses the pre-4 and the voter will cast a provisional ballot. Finally, a few general reminders. When in doubt, ask the inspector or county election board. And never turn anyone away from the polls. Everyone has the right to cast a provisional ballot.
As you can see, elections take more planning and attention to detail than most voters ever realize. I hope this video has provided you with a solid understanding of the many jobs that go into conducting a successful election. For more information about any of these topics, talk to your county election board or visit the Secretary of State's website at sos.in.gov. On behalf of the Secretary of State and the Election Division, thank you for your service to Indiana.